I'm Noel Durdant-Hollenby. Today's episode features another double barrel. Julian Forbes-Laird of FLAC, or the Forbes-Laird Arboricultural Consultancy. And amongst Julian's talents, of which more later, is the fact that he's an expert witness. And it occurred to me that if I ever came up in front of the beak, I think I'd get Julian in to be my expert witness, and I think it might play out something like this.
All rise! Court in session!
Julian Durdant-Hollenby, you stand before this court today charged with the unlawful removal of a woodland subject to DPO restrictions. How do you plead?
Once again, I would stress that the advice is not clear. I've said this time and time again.
Order. Clerk, who is this defendant's expert witness?
Why, it's Mr. Forbes-Laird, sir.
Call him, would you?
Call Julian Forbes-Laird!
Call Julian Forbes-Laird. Listen to the tree lady talk.
Julian Forbes-Laird is an analytical juggernaut in human form. A force for good standing up for common sense in a world full of ambiguity. A man who says what he means and means what he says. Can all this be true, I hear you say? Well, keep listening as he talks to the tree lady herself in this episode of Tree Lady Talks.
Hello, this is Tree Lady Talks, and I'm Sharon Durdant-Hollenby. All music and production is by Noel Durdant-Hollenby, and all views expressed by me or the interviewees are entirely personal. Julian, it's so lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.
For those who don't know you, please could you tell us a little bit about you and your career?
Okay, so I come from a slightly odd background. About 1,000 years ago, I was in the army, and if I ever dare say that at home, one of my children says, "We're back with the Roman army, Dad." So I was in the army for a little while. I didn't do anything exciting or brave or clever, so this is not a bigging myself up thing. From there, I then went to university where I read theology, which is obviously highly relatable to warfare. But my heart being in warfare, I then did a master's in war studies and international relations, which was very interesting. I paid for that by working part-time for a local tree surgeon. I was dragging brush and cutting things up. And across that period of a year, I started climbing trees and enjoyed doing that. So when I finished my master's, the Berlin Wall came down. Nobody wanted defense analysts anymore, which is what I had wanted to be. And I just stayed doing tree work. They'd had 10 years on the tools before making the switch into consultancy in 2000.
And you run a practice known as Forbes-Laird Consultancy?
Well, it's abbreviated to FLAC, a name given to it, in fact, by Richard Nicholson, for which I'm very grateful.
Tell us about the remit of your consultancy and some of the unique methods you've come up with which have helped the industry.
FLAC is very broadly based, deliberately so, because I find that's the best way to proof against recessions, is to have many tentacles, and arboriculture does lend itself to that. Most of our work is planning and development, but we also have a strong offering on tree risk assessment and control. Some of my first consultancy experience was in that area, where I had a consultancy job for Highways England, looking after a section of the trunk route network in my locality. I had 3 years providing consultancy advice on that. And it was whilst working in that area that I designed Threats in 1998, Tree Hazard Risk Evaluation and Treatment System. So Threats is designed to convey the technical aspects of tree risk to non-specialists. So I could ring up a highways engineer and I'd say I would need a road closed because I have a tree which is dangerous. And they would say, well, how dangerous? And well, how do you answer that question unless you have some way of quantifying it, which is what I came up with Threats. A few years later, the methodology that's quite widely used in the UK came into being, which was TEMPO, Tree Evaluation Method for Preservation Orders. It's designed as a simple check and balance system for determining TPO suitability for trees and tree
That's
groups.
a really good system. I use that a lot, both when I'm looking at trees, are they worthy of a tree preservation order or not, from either side of the fence. And it's quite easy to sort of work out, and it's easily and freely available, isn't it? If you just put in tempo and you can download the template.
Absolutely. As is threats, I believe in turning these things loose up to a point. I have actually got other methods which I use which are not freely available. I keep them to myself. But it is in that vein that I try and go about much of my work, which is if there is something which could be improved by systematizing it, I try and design a system that will do that job. And one of my first experiences of arboricultural consultancy was an extremely tedious public inquiry where the first day of evidence was spent arguing about, is it a grade B tree or is it a grade C tree? Or perhaps it's a grade A tree, or maybe it's a D, as it used to be back then. And I thought, well, this is ridiculous because people can't agree on the quality of a tree to very large error bars. Then we're never going to get anywhere in arboriculture. We have to have some way of being rational about that. So that when I first started working with British Standards Institute in 2003 on BS 5837 2005, as it was then, one of the first things I wanted to sink my fangs into was sorting out tree quality assessment methodology. And hence Table 1 was born and then found its way in refined form into the 2012 version of BS 5837.
I think that works really well. It's actually quite intuitive. So I've carried out some training with arboriculturalists and planners and architects, and I can just give a presentation, I can show some trees on a slide and just say, come on, what's your feeling? What do you think? And generally, it's quite intuitive. And even with my own work, it's never challenged. The categorization of my trees are never challenged.
But that's the thing. That's the thing, isn't it? I do several public inquiries a year. We never have a conversation about quality of the tree anymore.
I think it's too narrow. This is for me to be controversial now. I think the British Standard needs to look beyond just quantifying the value of trees and then how they're going to be cared for and assessed and all the different methods you would use to take it through to completion. I think we need to be looking a lot more holistically at canopy cover, at ecosystem services, and really bringing in together the ecology and the landscape design and projecting it forward over time. You also have been working on looking at canopy cover as well. And do you feel like me that you're entering a new era in arboriculture where not only are trees higher on the political agenda, but also how we quantify what we're looking at and how we make a deeper assessment is changing?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you raised the example of canopy cover. This is a requirement adopted in its new local plan by Oxford City Council that canopy cover shall be maintained at the same level as part of development proposals. And this is extremely challenging. They do operate the policy flexibly to account for future canopy cover, so you can measure it over time. And it is in that context, whilst working for University College Oxford recently, that we developed a model that would do precisely that. But in essence, you can measure the existing canopy cover on the site using the tree survey data in a CAD program. You can then project that forward in light of estimated retention span of the trees and in terms of future growth potential given their age class and species and what have you. And you can then look at a reduction in canopy cover from removal to facilitate development and then its replacement over time with new planting. And you can model all of those to find out how many new trees you need to achieve parity with what's being removed. It's a pretty powerful tool. I believe Oxford City Council are considering adopting it as their standard methodology.
Without knowing that we were each working on it, we've been working on the same thing. But I mean, who cares? The principle is it's about providing something measurable, because I've noticed that's made a real difference in my own consultancy, where we're saying we're going to look after trees, if during the construction phase there's then an issue or can we remove this tree or there's no longer room for this, you can say no, because it's all enshrined that we've got to meet this equivalent canopy cover and the equivalent ecosystem services at a given sort of year. So I've found it's meant better budget setting, a much greater understanding of how important the trees are, and it's made a measurable difference to my work. So I'm excited about the future, but it's going to get a little bit more complicated.
I think it will. I think it will.
So we've talked about positivity here, but not all is well in the world, is it, Julian?
No, not remotely. Not
I
remotely.
remember meeting you about 10 years or so at a Arboricultural conference, and for some reason I felt it appropriate that I should arm wrestle you. Now, is that a fake reality? Did I remember?
To be fair, I don't remember that, but the chances are I was probably as intoxicated as you must have been to make that
Yes.
challenge. So
Yes.
it's not
Yeah.
surprising I don't remember.
No, that's absolutely fine. But as I say, not all is well in the world. And one of the reasons why I want to talk to you, because you are a deep thinker and you're very analytical and considered. And you're just not happy about a number of things, of one of which is the Ancient Woodland Inventory. Tell us, what's wrong with that?
Okay, so forgive me for going Jeremy Clarkson on you quite so soon, but straightforwardly, the Ancient Woodland Inventory is a fake. In fact, it's the second greatest environmental fraud currently being perpetrated on people in our country. I won't tell you what the first is, but it is the second greatest. And the reason it's a fake is because of how it was compiled. It was compiled largely on the basis of a desk-based assessment, though with some field work in 25 to 30% of cases. The problem is that the historical base that was used by the Natural England research teams to compile it dates back only in a very few cases before 1840 or so, perhaps 1835. What this means is that there is, in most cases, over 200 years of evidence gap between the 1600 AD onset threshold for ancient woodland and any evidence of ancient woodland in a particular case. And so, for example, if you hear that HS2 is going to destroy or damage 93 ancient woodlands, that's 93 woodlands known from the Victoria era onwards, though possibly there may be a few where they have older records, but that is exceptionally rare. And what this means is that the Ancient Woodland Inventory is not a catalogue of woodland present since 1600 AD, which is what on its face it purports to be, but in fact it's a catalogue of woodland mapped by the Victorians and present continuously since. The reason this matters is because 1600 AD was chosen as the threshold for ancient woodland by Spencer and Kirby and a couple of others. But it was chosen simply because, firstly, it was the period after which maps started to become more freely available. And in their original vision, they were looking at large areas of woodland as qualifying. But more importantly, from 1650 approximately till 1850, there was a period of substantial reforestation, particularly in lowland Britain, such that scholars working in this field refer to that period as the Great Replanting. And during the period of Great Replanting, it is unknown quite how many acres of forest were set, but it's very substantial indeed. And what this means is that if you have a woodland present on a map from, say, 1870 onward, okay, 150-year mapping record of woodland, the balance of probability is that woodland was a creature of the Great Replanting, not a remnant ancient woodland. Unfortunately, what Natural England has done is turned this reality on its head. And they exercise what we call the Victorian presumption, whereby if a woodland is present from the Victorian era onwards, it is presumed to have been present from 1600 onwards. This, of course, has the practical effect of rewriting the definition of ancient woodland. So instead of land continuously wooded since 1600, in Natural England's day-to-day terms, it's land continuously wooded since 1840, 50, 60, or 70. And what this does is it totally undermines the entire theory and premise of ancient woodland, which is for long undisturbed woodland, creating a niche habitat and prioritized biodiversity hotspot, which can be the case. So instead, you have very large numbers of secondary woodland, wrongly calculated or assessed as being ancient woodland, and this is then taken forward into the planning world. If you couple this with the elevated protection for ancient woodland in the National Planning Policy Framework, it really matters that these things are so often wrong. Then there is the question of protecting them physically. How do you do that as part of layout design? Well, as you know, Natural England recommend a 15-metre buffer zone. But the Woodland Trust is lobbying for that to be extended to 50 or in some cases 100 metres. At the same time, Natural England is continuously revising the inventory to identify smaller and smaller fragments of ancient woodland, so that you've now got ancient woodlands of less than a hectare being included in the inventory. If you put all of these things together, if that buffer zone goes from 15 metres to 50, let's say, you're going to suddenly find you can't deliver most of your housing allocations in the south of England. That has a terrible and catastrophic knock-on effect for the housing crisis. And all because of wrong identification of ancient woodland. That's why it matters. We've got hundreds of thousands of houses missing from our national inventory. We're struggling to deliver the right housing numbers. And unfortunately, it's going to get a lot worse. If that buffer zone goes up to 50 meters, the knock-on effect is going to be quite staggering. And of course, natural England being a law unto itself, there is no regulatory impact assessment. It can simply decide to make that change. And should it do so, most local plans in the southeast especially are just going to unravel on the spot.
Well, several things I want to unpick from that. What are the other measures of ancient woodland and why it really matters in terms of woodland preservation is the ecosystem it provides, the woodland indicator, ancient woodland indicator species. That's all very important.
You're absolutely right.
And that should be a measure.
Absolutely. I should disclose that I work extensively in this field as part of a bidisciplinary practice called Sylvan Consulting. I work with Alistair Baxter, who's the Senior Director, and therefore my opposite number at Aspect Ecology, one of the country's leading ecological consultancies. And he and I have developed a niche practice in ancient woodland investigation. So we are getting down and dirty in tracts of woodland all over the country. We've done many dozens of investigations now looking at these things, and absolutely one of the key markers we are searching for in our field work are indications that a woodland is ancient. So what we're looking for when we go into the field are markers of ancientness, which comprise, broadly speaking, the following. Firstly, silvio-archaeological remains. These would include, but are not limited to, wood banks. But on the subject of wood banks, there need to be a particular sort of size and shape for them to indicate significant antiquity. Then we're looking for old-growth arboricultural features, such as ancient trees, not veteran trees, but really old trees that will go back to before 1600. Old-growth coppice stools, they can be another marker, and they can survive for many hundreds of years. I think our record is 1360. We've dated one coppice stool too. And also stumps of very large trees, because a tree stump showing the tree rings that can give you an indication as to its age when it was felled, and the rate and state of decomposition can give you a guide as to how long ago it was felled. So if you've got a 250-year-old tree from Ringwitz, and that tree looks like it's been decomposing for around 100 years, you're most of the way back to the 1600 threshold. And then, of course, there is the floristic evidence, ancient woodland indicator species, and finally, mycological indicator species. We've been working on developing a list with a mycologist called Nev Kilkenny, who has pointed us in the right direction of source material for fungi that are indicative of very long established woodland. So we put all of these pieces of evidence together. And the approach we have, in fact, looks at 28 separate pieces of evidence. We bolt them all together, and then we look at the for and against case as to whether woodland is ancient or not. What I would like to say is that in many cases where we identify a woodland is actually ancient, the current biodiversity condition of it is extremely poor.
Yes, it's all down to management.
All down to management, exactly. So the theory of ancient woodland as a biodiversity hotspot is just a theory. And a secondary woodland of 200 years old that's been properly managed may well have much greater biodiversity offering than an ancient woodland that's been neglected for the same period. And one of our concerns is that the branding prominence given to ancient woodland by the likes of Natural England and the Woodland Trust has the effect of detracting from a proper objective assessment of the biodiversity in secondary woodland, which in many cases is high.
So are you saying it's too emotionally laden, that
Yes.
just clouds a judgment and creates a blanket?
Exactly. It's a departure from science. That's what I'm concerned about.
Yes, so you're looking at it from scientific. I applaud the forensic way that you're looking at, the history, the land archaeology, the tree archaeology, as it were, looking at the size of the trees, the ancient woodland indicator species of the flora, and pleased to hear that you're looking at the fungal assessment as well. And I absolutely agree it's about management in that, a lapsed coppice that's been lapsed for over 100 years, everything's very shady. sycamore rhododendrons have been allowed to come in and take over. It may have that ancient woodland badge, but it may be far less floristically diverse than a much younger woodland that's been copied on a regime, etc., etc. I would like to put to you, though, something else. We're living in a time of a nature crisis and also a climate crisis. We know how important woodlands are for not only the ecosystem they provide, but also our own well-being. Surely it's better to have slightly more woodlands protected than not enough. Because you're looking at it from a pure scientific, analytical point of view. I say, actually, life's messier than that. And actually, better to catch too many than not enough. So what do you say about that, JFL?
All right. Okay. So the answer to that is found at paragraph 175C of the framework, National Planning Policy Framework in the UK for England and Wales. And this paragraph provides protection at national level against loss or deterioration of irreplaceable habitats, one such being ancient woodland, as you know. And the key here is that protection is loss or deterioration. So it's pretty unusual for development to go into woodland in a way that significantly affects the area of woodland. You might, for example, put an access road through, but an access road into a development through a 10 or 20 hectare woodland is not really going to make significant difference. After all, the Great Forest of Windsor has a number of A-class roads running through it. It doesn't detract from the overall forest. But the concern that I have is with relation to deterioration, because this is really where the ancient woodland buffer zone comes in. It's designed to stop effects from nearby development leaching into the ancient woodland, and is a perfectly sound principle, by the way. And even when I'm designing schemes as part of multidisciplinary teams looking at secondary woodland, I'm always seeking to build in a buffer zone. It is a good thing to have, and I recommend it. The question is how wide that buffer zone should be. Now, in my experience, there are very few cases where the minimum recommended 15-meter buffer isn't sufficient. And my worry is that, as I mentioned earlier, if that is increased significantly, that has a terrible impact on allocation of housing land, which, as you know, is in very short supply.
Yes, absolutely.
And if we lose housing land, we lose houses, and that means people lose homes. So if you're then saying protect more woodlands, well, I'd say, yeah, but not necessarily at the expense of giving people somewhere to live. And we are not, as I say, talking about woodland loss here, but we're talking about a theoretical deterioration of woodland from nearby development. So that's why I have a concern.
One of the things I think about that is I agree with buffer zones. I would struggle to agree with a 50-metre one, except in exceptional circumstances. I always agree with 15 metres. Sometimes I think it should be 20. Just because if you've got an ancient or veteran tree on the boundary, I've scanned roots of those trees and find they go out further. The other thing I would say about development is that it is often an opportunity. If that woodland is owned by the client, or there can be a Section 106 agreement to ensure its proper, careful management, you can actually bring in to good management neglected woodlands to benefit biodiversity and people. If that's controlled in such a way with really sensitive waymarking and path creation, then actually you are increasing the biodiversity and you're meeting that need within us as humans who need somewhere decent to live and somewhere beautiful to go. Whilst I think you may be scientifically correct, I, in this current time, think it's more useful to have slightly more than not enough captured. But I do think it's an opportunity, if we're going to build near woodlands, that money is diverted into the management of those woodlands as part of that, using some of the people who actually are going to move in.
What we always do when we're assessing a woodland, regardless if we find it to be ancient or secondary woodland, we always go on an evidence-led basis as to its quality by virtue of its actual biodiversity, not theoretical biodiversity. And it's the protection of the actual value, not the theoretical value, which is important. And if you look at the National Planning Policy Framework now, you'll find that irreplaceable habitat has a higher level of protection and planning system than triple SIs. But for a site to be designated as SSSI for biodiversity, it has to pass a rigorous evidence-led assessment process. No such process applies to ancient woodland. So you can have an ancient woodland of theoretical value that's probably not ancient anyway, given higher protection than a SSSI for biodiversity, and that cannot be right.
And have you shared your views with Natural England?
Repeatedly, without stopping, and for some time.
Any response?
Oh yes, we've had many exchanges on a significant number of sites. We have been successful in removing false positive identifications from quite a few woodlands. Sometimes it's taken a public inquiry decision to do it. We're not always successful, but despite this is one of the frustrations in the process, despite the Natural England explicitly acknowledging that the inventory is provisional and will be updated when further information comes to light. Even when you present the further information, there is a very strong inbuilt resistance to revising inventory, which I think is very unscientific and very unfortunate.
Fascinating. And thank you for really talking that through, because it's something that I hadn't thought about in depth, the actual inventory itself. So thank you for that. I think that will spur a lot of debate. I think what you have to say could have real significance. I'm a bit more bigger picture and a bit fuzzier about it, in that woods are good for wildlife, they're good for people. But of course, what you're saying is if it goes to 50 metres, then the local plans will unravel. Want to meet Julian in person? Well, FLAC is delighted to offer another pair of 2-day events in May this year. The first is in the Forest of Arden Marriott on the 13th and 14th of May. The second is on the University of Dundee Botanic Gardens on the 20th and 21st of May. These are live in-person events with COVID measures in place. You'll get 11 hours of world-class CPD delivered in 8 lectures with a mix of classroom and field work, and a really great networking opportunity. Boy, do we need that right now. If you're interested, do follow the links to our website or go direct to flac.uk.com. The other thing you wanted to talk about was the felling licence operations note 52. This is a really detailed operations note. Tell us what you think about that.
Yeah, so the background to this has been a couple of tree preservation order prosecutions, or attempted tree preservation order prosecutions. One of which was a couple of years ago in Warwick district, where a person had a felling license, enacted the felling license. The trees had a tree preservation order on, and they did not have a tree preservation order consent. The local authority sought to prosecute the person concerned, but the person concerned paraded aid the felling license and enlisted the Forestry Commission to write to the local authority enforcement officer explaining how the law worked to the local authority. So the Forestry Commission did this, and they pointed out that if trees are subject to the requirement of a felling license, then the Forestry Act takes primacy over the Town and Country Planning Act, and that local authorities have only one opportunity to intervene, and that is if they object to the granting of the felling license. So what should happen is, when you apply for a felling license, you are supposed, according to the Forestry Felling of Trees Regulations 1979, to state whether or not TPO applies to those trees or if they stand in a conservation area. The Forestry Commission is supposed to notify the local authority in whose jurisdiction the trees stand that a felling license application has been received, and give the local authority a right of consultation on that felling license application, so that if the council were to object to the granting of the license, then the Forestry Commission are no longer able to grant that license. It then becomes determined, in effect, as if it were a tree preservation order appeal.
Yes, and that was, I remember that when I was a tree officer years ago, receiving those notifications and checking them and going back, and I believe there was one that we objected to.
Yeah. Unfortunately, what the Forestry Commission do now is they maintain a public register of felling license applications, and they have put the onus on local authorities to check those on a regular basis to make sure none of their TPO trees are affected by felling license applications.
So let's just get this straight here. the tree officer, who is not exactly twiddling his or her thumbs, who is firefighting every day with the myriad of tasks they have to do, then has to remember, perhaps weekly,
Yes.
to go onto the felling licence register
Yes.
in order to check that there's no conflict.
Yes, exactly.
I'm just talking this out loud now, thinking out loud now. If the Forestry Commission does not get a response from the local authority and the applicant either doesn't know there's a tree preservation order or fails to disclose that, then the felling licence is granted.
Yes.
And then the landowner or the applicant can then go and fell the trees, but in fact it is a breach. And so, is it a breach of the TPO?
No, it's not.
Because the local authority, but that isn't a fair system, is it? Because you're relying on the management and the time of the tree officer. So the Forestry Commission have put that burden back on the local authority without making it easy for them to do so.
Exactly. It's actually much, much worse than this. We've only just scratched the surface of how bad this system is. Okay. So I'm going to just read a little bit now from section 15, subsection 6 of Forestry Act 1967. Where in the case of trees to which a tree preservation order relates, a felling license is granted after the date on which the order comes into force, the license shall, notwithstanding anything in that order, be sufficient authority for the felling of any trees to which the order relates. So if you have a pre-existing TPO, when a felling license is granted, it is sufficient authority for the felling of trees. And that doesn't change whether the local authority noticed the application or not, and they didn't in the Warwick case. And that doesn't change whether the applicant notifies the Forestry Commission that there is a TPO in force or not. Because once that license is granted, it is a tablet of stone document, and you can use it to fell the trees, regardless of their TPO or conservation area status. Unbelievably, it gets worse still. If a local authority objects to a felling license, as I've explained, the matter is then taken away from the Forestry Commission and becomes determined under the Planning Acts. In other words, Town and Country Planning Act 1990, as amended. If that doesn't happen, section 15, subsection 5 of the Forestry Act operates. I'll read it to you. Except as provided by the foregoing provisions of this section, as in the consultation rights to the local authority, no relevant application shall be entertained in respect of the felling of trees in the case of which section 9.1 of this act applies so as to require a felling license. What that means is that if you have a tree that requires a felling license or trees that require a felling license, local authorities are disallowed by law from even entertaining a TPO application on those trees.
That's surprising.
Yes. Local authorities up and down the country are busily determining applications under TPOs where the trees in fact fall under the felling license regime, as in if they're not in gardens, churchyards or public open places. But they are disallowed by law. There is no such thing as a TPO consent on a tree that requires a felling license. It's not a thing.
So that's shocking. I wonder.
Yes,
So
I know.
Who knows about this other than you?
Well, the Forestry Commission.
So what did the Forestry Commission say?
So this is where we come on to Forestry Commission Operations Note 52, which explains all this.
Oh, okay.
And the reason they have published, well, they won't admit this, but the reason they've published this operations note, and I can't say too much about the context, but there is a matter going before the courts in due course where I'm involved and they're involved, and they've published it within that context, shall we say. They've set the law out in the operations note, and they make absolutely clear what I've just been saying to you. I'm not telling you anything that they don't say. It's just that this is not something which had been said at all by the Forestry Commission in terms until the answer they gave in the Warwick case as to why the local authority couldn't prosecute the felling of those trees. So what they said, and I have on my other screen here, I have the email from the Forestry Commission to the enforcement officer at Warwick District Council. It's a public document. It's nothing I've obtained by subterfuge. It's off the council website. It says, a person wishing to fell trees covered by a TPO that fall within the requirements for a felling license must apply for a felling license before felling them. Otherwise, that person commits an offence under Section 17 of the 1967 Act, the Forestry Act. But given that the need for a felling licence means that an application for consent under Regulation 13 of the Town and Country Planning Tree Preservation England Regulations 2012 is excluded because no relevant application shall be entertained, felling the trees without the TPO regulations consent cannot amount to an offence under Section 210 of the Town and Country Planning Act. That is what the Forestry Commission said on the Warwick case on the 1st of February 2018. And they're right. That was absolutely right. Unfortunately, that's not what Forestry Commission's Operations Note July 2020 says. They have changed their mind. And what they're saying now is that if you end up felling a tree without a felling license, where you should have had one, and you fell that same tree and it's got a TPO on it, you have committed two separate criminal offences. This is magical thinking. It cannot be right. And it cannot be right because the local authority are disallowed by law from entertaining a TPO application. They cannot, therefore, on that tree, grant permission to fell it under the TPO. The law cannot require people to pass an impossible test. Obviously, it can't do that. So if the test is you have to have a TPO consent, but it's impossible to get one because the local authority can't grant one, you cannot have committed the offence of not having that consent. The operations note says quite the contrary. It says that two offences can arise, but it forgets the most important thing, which is that Regulation 13 in the trees regs, to give them their colloquial term, says that you have to have the written consent of the local authority to fell the TPO tree. And yet, if it's a tree subject to felling license regime, the local authority is not allowed in law to give that written consent.
Okay. Wow. So have you spoken to the Forestry Commission about this?
I've got 30 pages of correspondence and counting, to the extent they're now declining to continue the discussion.
Well, thank you for bringing that to our attention. It's something that I had always understood the law as it is. So in my practice as a tree officer and now a consultant, I believe that the felling licence, to put it in layman's terms, if I may, superseded the requirement for a tree preservation order application. You know, you've got the felling licence, so therefore you do not need to make a TPO application. That's how I've always operated.
Correct.
As a consultant, I would let the tree officer know anyway because I'm just nervous. I said, well, this is happening. Keep you in the loop because it's a good-mannered thing to do.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for that, Julian. That was really interesting and surprising. I wonder now if you could talk about the issuing of a felling licence by the Forestry Commission for removal of 30% of highway trees in England on trunk roads.
This is why these issues of felling licenses and tree preservation orders really matter. I've explained to you the process that is supposed to happen, where there is a legal requirement under the 1979 Forestry Felling of Trees regulations for applicants for felling licenses to state whether or not these trees, the trees within the application, are covered by tree preservation orders, and by extension stand within conservation areas. And this is precisely so that it will trigger the cascade of consent and negotiation with the local planning authority. Absent that due process, you then have a very disturbing situation whereby local authorities may well not be made aware of the TPO. Potentially, they wouldn't even be put on the public register. Highways England wanted to be able to carry out works adjacent to the trunk route network throughout England without the tiresome bore, which only applies to little people like us, of having to fill in a Forestry Commission license application form every time. So what they did was they applied for all the highway trees in trunk roots in England to be subject to a felling license to the extent of approximately 30% of those trees. It's down as a thinning operation, but clearly there would be localized concentrations of felling. I don't know, put up a new footbridge or a new gantry sign or whatever it happens to be. And they applied for this license. It's the largest felling license ever issued. I've got it on screen in front of me. The total land coverage is 9,634 hectares. And if you go on the Forestry Commission's GIS system on its website and have a look at this felling license, I mean, you could see the damn thing from space. Okay, it's as big as you could imagine, because it's all the trunk root network. In some cases, it's out to 120, 140 meters from the edge of the road. Often it's closer 20 to 30. But I mean, it's an absolute monster. And the alarming thing is that the vast majority of the land is not under Highways England ownership. Now, at the time that the license was granted, Highways England was a private limited company, albeit owned by the government. So this is it's not a quango as such. It's actually a legally distinct entity. And to facilitate the relationship between Forestry Commission and Highways England, these two bodies entered into a now cancelled memorandum of understanding, which was never published, which we obtained under Freedom of Information request, that set out how the relationship would operate. But of great concern are certain aspects of this felling license which are unique to it. Let me tell you what these are. Firstly, however, you should understand that under the Forestry Act 1967, there are only two conditions that can be applied to a felling license, and they deal with restocking and aftercare. There's no other conditionality that can be applied to a felling license. It's simply, can I fell the trees? Yes. And then prescribed by law, one or both of these two conditions can be attached. On this felling license, it carries a note. And I'm just going to read from it so we're getting it verbatim. So I'm looking away. Okay. This license does not negate the requirements for consulting statutory agencies with regard to particular woodlands and trees. For example, this license does not provide consent for work on trees under a tree preservation order or within a conservation area.
Well, haven't we just talked about that earlier?
Yes, we have. So the Forestry Commission put that note on the license, knowing full well that under the law, those trees subject to a felling license were not subject to the requirements of TPO or conservation area consent. Now let's ask why. The reason why is found on Highways England's application form.
That was going to be my question, actually.
Yes. Section 4 of the felling license application, tree preservation orders and conservation areas. Question 1, are any of the trees to be felled subject to a tree preservation order? They've ticked no. Question 2, are any of the trees to be felled within a conservation area? Again, they've ticked no. I have, in correspondence with the Forestry Commission, got their written confirmation that they allowed Highways England to fraudulently, and you can broadcast this, fraudulently tick no to those two questions, knowing that Highways England had not checked whether those trees were subject to TPO or conservation area protection. So in other words, the Forestry Commission and Highways England agreed between themselves to set aside the requirements of the 1979 regulations, for which the Forestry Commission has no power. As I say, the law applies only to little people, not to big ones. All of this I have documented, all of it. So
well, several things come out of that surprised me. One is I actually thought the 1980s Highway Act enabled some tree works to be carried out if absolutely necessary for the interests of the operation of the highway, and therefore felling licence wouldn't be required in those situations. Let's say a tree is obscuring the highway and at a dangerous situation, so you would not need a felling licence or TPO consent in that situation. But what you also said that really surprised me is that the area, the width of what's defined as Highway England land is vast. So we're not talking about carriageway trees here where we're driving down the motorway looking at planting either side. You're talking about other land that's in their interest. And so what would be their motive?
A motive that has been alleged relates to European Union grant funding for forestry operations. Not my field, it's not something I've looked into, and I don't know if that is correct or not.
I understand the felling licence expires in March this year. Do you have any idea of how many trees have been felled under that felling licence? Has it been enacted?
It's my understanding that some works have been carried out as necessary. I have no idea as to the extent. What I can say is that I have represented a client who undertook felling within the felling license area 145 meters away from the highway, which is the reach of this license in that particular location. So the coverage is really quite extensive. But because the checks and balances system of the regulations has been deliberately subverted by Forestry Commission to benefit Highways England, this felling license was issued without the vast majority of local authorities affected by it, and I would hazard a guess that it's almost all the local authorities being consulted as regards their trees subject to TPO or conservation area protection. And with offset distances into the hundreds of meters from their trunk route, it's an absolute racing certainty, as was found to be in the case of my client, that TPO trees and trees in conservation areas absolutely would have been affected. And yet this was never checked by Highways England with the agreement of Forestry Commission. And so local authorities have been denied their rights of consultation. Frankly, I think it's monstrous.
Well, I had never heard of this until we spoke today, so I'm really glad you brought it to our attention. In a Jeremy Clarkson theme here, is there another thing, Julian?
There is just one other thing. I'm sitting in front of a background of a photograph I took in Sumatra in 2018. I spent some time in the jungle there looking at some of the processes that were going on, jungle regeneration, how old are the trees before they tend to get taken down by fungal attack and insects. And it's amazing actually how very few trees appear to be much over 150 years old. The recycling processes in the jungle are really very swift. But this particular area, Sumatra, was an orangutan reserve. And to get to the orangutan reserve, we had to drive many tens of kilometers through palm oil plantations. The vast majority of these palm oil plantations were planted in areas of formerly cleared jungle. And the primary driver for the setting of the palm oil in this area and in many others is to meet the European Union requirement for 10% biodiesel. And the law of unintended consequence that is often ignored by regulatory bodies is if you do make a significant change and you do something bold and you make a statement with a policy, have you actually thought through what happens downstream? And they hadn't thought through what happened downstream. So with the goal of trying to use a little bit less fossil fuel in the cars and lorries of Europe, what they've actually led is to destructions of tens of thousands of kilometers of primary jungle, amongst which it's orangutan habitat, to replace them with palm oil monocultures. So the other thing that I'm happy about is people not thinking through policies before they enact them.
Thank you. Yes, I've heard of that. And I think there's going to be increasing joined up thinking. I'm positive about that, but that is a very unfortunate consequence of what was a good idea that turned out to be a bad consequence. So thank you. And finally, Julian, what is your dream scenario?
Well, I've been asked to do a 5-city lecture tour in Australia in November of this year, and I'd very much hope that COVID restrictions will permit that to happen. Otherwise, it may have to wait another year till 2022.
So thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting to speak to you. And the first podcast we've had really, which highlight problems and controversy. So thank you for bringing a different style of interview.
You're very welcome, and nice to see you again, Sharon.
I thought that went all right.
It was really great to have somebody a bit controversial on this time.
Do you know what? And it's interesting you say that, because I think he came out with the first ever Forbes-Lairdism that I've ever heard.
What's that?
Systematising. Here it is.
If there is something which could be improved by systematising it.
But seriously though, if people listening to this don't agree, well, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, who could possibly not agree? Well, I suppose there are people. I mean,
everybody's different.
How are we going to do it?
Everybody has a point of view. So if you're listening and you don't agree, and particularly if you work for Natural England or the Forestry Commission, do get in touch.
Okay, if you want to get in touch with us, email me, Noel, at treeladytalks.co.uk.
Don't sit quietly if this has got your blood boiling, or you're feeling the same way about it as Julian. Do let us know.
It's nice being like the BBC, isn't it? I mean, impartial and all that sort of thing. I mean, and how did you feel about having another double barrel on the end of the phone?
Oh well, my life is awash with double barrels now.
I think it's magnificent. It's just magnificent thing, marvellous. So anyway, that's pretty much all we have time for.
Just so you know, listeners, we're going to have a week off because we're preparing for a special episode.
Oh, we're not going on holiday?
No.
Oh, no, we can't go on holiday.
Because we're in lockdown. The forthcoming episode is with Treeconomics, and we're going to be looking at what is iTree, why does it matter, and how is it used? And most importantly, does it make a difference on the ground? It's going to be a great series of interviews in one action-packed episode.
Well, we look forward to hearing you then, or seeing you then, or whatever it is you do. And we will see you next time. So in the meantime, it's goodbye from me. And
before I say goodbye from him, I will remind listeners that we have a YouTube channel, and they can see YouTube clips from each episode at YouTube. Put in Sharon Hosegood Associates. Check out the videos there.
hit the subscribe button to guarantee you don't miss an episode, and you can follow us on
Twitter at the Tree Lady 67,
Instagram Tree Lady Talks,
Facebook Sharon Hosegood Associates,
or send an email to noel@treeladytalks.co.uk. Like, yeah, I think that was all right. Do you? I think that was fine.
Yeah, I do.
I think we should just go with that.
Yeah, so do I.
Should go with that. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, definitely.